In this video, I'm going to talk about functions with default arguments. Before I get into that, I'd like you to go and answer a few questions in your study notebook. So just a few warm-up questions, and you'll kind of see why as we go along. So very simple things here. Firstly, how do we declare and initialize or define a variable? Then what happens if we subsequently assign another value to that variable, so later on in the program? So very easy questions that you should be able to answer at this point. Okay, so I'm going to assume that you wrote those down, or you've thought about those at least, and I'm just going to move on here. Now, when a function is called, the number of arguments must match the number of formal parameters, right? So I talked about this previously. Now, this condition is relaxed for functions with default arguments. Alright, so what is a default argument? Well, basically a default argument refers to an initialized formal parameter. So again, you can declare and initialize a variable on one line, right, in one statement, as we've seen before, just like you can see where I have it underlined here in red. Default arguments are specified in the function declaration. Just as I mentioned in the previous video, you can declare and define a function at the same time, right at the top. That has to be before you actually invoke that function. Or you can have a separate declaration and a separate definition. So just want to make sure that the default argument is specified in the function declaration. You can see I have a simple example here. It takes in the current character health and it returns the boosted character health. So it returns an integer, it's not a void function. The function name is boosted health. In the first formal parameter we have the current health, so it takes in as an argument the current health. Then you can see we have the second parameter here is like a variable, similar to a variable that is declared and initialized in the same statement. But because this is a function, this basically means that we are assigning a default argument to this parameter. Sometimes these are called default parameters. I don't know why, but it doesn't really stick with me. But really what is happening is you are giving this parameter a default argument, right? How I kind of talk about these things might differ slightly to what you might see in text or in other tutorials. I'm just explaining it in a way that makes sense to me, and that will hopefully make more sense to you, so it's easier to remember and to see like what is going on. You can see simply we are assigning a default argument to this health boost parameter. Okay, so let's move on here. You have a few rules for functions with default arguments. Firstly, parameters with default arguments must be the rightmost parameters of the function. So in other words, those parameters will be right at the end of your function prototype or function header, right? Okay, then for a parameter with a default argument, if an argument is specified in the function call, that argument will override the default argument. If no argument is specified in the function call, then the default argument will be used. Okay, so it makes sense. We'll see exactly how to use the stuff in an upcoming example. Then in a function call, if no argument is specified to override a default argument, then you must omit specifying any further arguments. That is in a function with multiple default arguments. So let's say your first parameter does not have a default argument specified, again in your function declaration, but your second and third parameters do have default arguments specified. Okay, now in the function call, if no argument is specified to override the default argument that is specified for the second parameter, so what that means is you won't specify or give an argument, so for that second parameter, but that also means that you have to omit specifying an argument for the third parameter. So in that case, it's going to use the default arguments that are specified for formal parameter 2 and for formal parameter 3 in that example. But let's say you do specify an argument to override the default argument for formal parameter 2, for example, but you don't specify one for formal parameter 3, then it's going to use your arguments for formal parameters 1 and 2, but it's going to use the default argument for formal parameter 3, which again is set in the function declaration. Okay, so I hope that makes sense here. So before moving on, I'd like you to try and define this function, int boost health. You can see the prototype or the function header right here. Go ahead and write a small program with that, just for practice, basically. Okay, you can see it won't be that difficult to figure out how this is supposed to work. As a hint, you basically just add current health and health boost together and return the result back to the calling function. And when I come back, I'll show you how I did that and how you would go about using these default arguments, or how you would go about overriding those default arguments. But go ahead, play around and apply what you know at this point and see if you can get this function to work. Of course, you want to add the comments and such, but this is just a quick demonstration. Also, you can decide if you want to declare it and then, define it later. In this case, I'm just declaring and defining it in one go up here. If I build and run this, you can see what we get. Okay. So in main, you can see I just have this int variable, current health. I print that out, and I also print boosted health is. And here I call that function, which will return this. So you might not need these parentheses, but I do that anyway. So how do we go and use this here? So you can see I have this default argument. So here, this right here is the default argument. Okay. We set this to 15 by default. It's similar to passing in 15 as an argument, but of course that is set by default. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove this, and I'll just type that out again. I'll type the opening parentheses for that function call. The IntelliSense pops up. Okay, it tries to help us here, and it will show us what it returns. So it returns an integer, the function name. So it basically shows us the function header. The function prototype or the function header will show up in this pop-up right here. Then we can see what the parameters are. So int health. So we want to pass in the current health. You might change that parameter name to current health. That might be more obvious. Then in the second parameter, you can see we have int health boost is equal to 15. So because that is declared and initialized, we know that that has a default argument set to 15. So I can either use it like this. You don't have to do the comma. You can leave it like this. So if those have default arguments, you just leave them out. You don't do a comma, right? So you can do it like this and it will work. Or what you can do is Control-Shift spacebar to get that back, to get this header back here. Again, because this might be way up in the file, alright? So we want to see it right here. So again, you can get that back by clicking in here, Control-Shift and spacebar. So let's say we want to change that now, because currently it's going to use that default argument. Let's say 25. And now you can see that will highlight. If I click on this one, Control-Shift spacebar, you can see that is the highlighted one or the bolded one. Control-Shift spacebar on that, you can see that is the bolded one. It tries to show you like where you are in the parameter list. So these kinds of things are important to kind of get used to, these helpers and stuff like that. And it's going to become more and more useful and important as you go along, especially in Module 102, and especially if you do game development in Unreal Engine 4, for example, or if you go and use third-party libraries, because then you don't always see in your file what the declaration or the definition is. So then it becomes important to start using these helpers. So now that that is set, we have the current health passed in that first parameter, and then we change the default argument. So this 25 will now override 15. That is again similar to when you have a variable declared and initialized, like we do up here, and later on in the program, you go and change that. So you assign something else to that variable. So let's say this was a variable in main, right? So int health is equal to 15. Then later on, we set that to 25. What's going to happen? Well, it's not going to be 15 anymore. It's now going to be 25. So it's similar to working with variables as you are already familiar with. Alright, so let's just go and Control F5, build and run this. This should give us 50, yeah. Current health is 25, boosted health is 50. I mentioned that you might want to change this here to current health, but then you might want to change this here back to health. Something like that, right? You want to avoid repeating variable names as much as you can. I'll have to go and update those. So you want to try and avoid, as I mentioned, having repeated variable names just because it can be a bit confusing. So now if I click on this, Control + spacebar, this help is more useful now. We can see the prototype or the header of the function. It says boost health. It takes in the current health. So what my character's current health is, right? That makes sense. And then also what we want to boost that health. So health boost is equal to 15. Just go and change that capitalization around and so forth, and you'll see that this works fine. Okay, so it's just a quick example. I hope you find this useful, and we'll move on to another example. Okay, so this example is very similar to the previous example. I basically just changed it to boost points, and this variable as well. You'll see currently we are dealing with points instead of health as we did in the previous example. You'll also see I changed a few things. So a few other things I changed. We now have int current points, point boost here as well, say to 15. And then we also have these two extra parameters that are added at the end. The first one is Boolean called bMultiply. I just wanted to reduce the length of some of these variable names, but you should probably call that should multiply or something like that. Then I also have this integer multiplier, which is set to 2 by default. Okay, so the point with this program is, let's say you have a game where you collect points, right? And in some instances you can get a bonus to those points or to the point boost, right? You can get some multiplier. Let's say you collect coins in the game, and let's say you collect 10 in less than a minute, so then you get that boost. Or let's say you collect a red coin or a gold coin, some special coin, maybe that gives you a boost. So again, it depends on the game that you're building, but you can see if we multiply, so if we have that multiplier set to true, then it will take the current points that I'll pass in, plus the point boost, and it will multiply that with a multiplier, which again by default is set to 2. Otherwise it's just going to return the current points plus the point boost. So you might have this apply to, let's say when you pick up a coin, and then this multiply will be false. It's just a regular coin. But if you pick up a special coin such as a gold coin or something else in your game, then you want the character to gain more points, okay, something like that. Then you go and set that to true and you pass in the multiplier if you don't want to use the default one. Okay, so in the main function you can see I print out again the current points and then the boosted points, and this is how you can call it. So for right now I'm going to run it like this. So I pass in the current points, I set that to 25, the point boost, so I'm overriding the default argument. I'm setting bMultiply to true, and then I'm overriding the multiplier as well. Okay, so current points 25, boosted points will be 125, because, so this will return this line here, current points plus the point boost, which is 25 multiplied by this down here. Remember, we pass these arguments and those will override what we have by default. So again, 25 times 4 is 100 plus 25, which is here. So we pass that in 25. So ultimately we'll get 125, okay? So how can we use this? Well, I'll remove all of those where we have default argument set, and you'll see this works just fine with those. 25, and it's going to add 15 to that. Then I can go and override some of these default arguments if I want. But here is the thing. Let's say I want to skip this one, so point boost, and I want to go directly to the multiply, set that to true, for example. So maybe I do a comma and just do true. Well, that's not going to work because it's only going to apply to the second parameter, which is an integer, okay? You can see it's highlighted in the header that shows up with the IntelliSense. You can see we are currently at the integer, so those don't match. Okay, so let's say I do a comma and do something like true. You can already see the red squigglies here. And if I go and build this, you'll get errors. You can see it says expected an expression. So the point is you have to pass in something here now. You can do it like this and then skip everything else. So this 3 now will override the point boost, which is set to 15 by default. build and run that, and you can see that works. And then we can go and set that to true if we want. Control F5 and run that, and you can see that will still work. The default for that again is 2, so 3 times 2 is 6, and 25 plus 6 will give you 31. And then once again, comma, and then you can go and override that default argument. So as you can see, you cannot go and simply skip some of these. Let's say again I want to skip the second parameter, and then I want to go and change this one to false. I mean, what you can always do is you can just go and set that to 15, which is the default anyway. Okay, so you can always look at what the default is and just set it to that. And then now I can do true, which is again overriding what the default argument is. So you do have those options. But the point here is, if I don't want to add anything, let's say for this third parameter, this third argument here, so this here is fine. We are specifying arguments for the first and second parameters. But now I cannot go and specify an argument for this parameter right here, unless I did a workaround as I showed you previously. If you want to skip the next one now, then you also have to skip that one at the end. So as I explained in the slides, if no argument is specified to override a default argument, then you must omit specifying any further arguments. Again, that is in a function with multiple default arguments. Okay, next I'm going to change things around a bit. So this will work just fine here. So I'm kind of messing up the program, but I just want to show you a few things. So let's have it like this. I have the prototype up here, or the declaration. Down here I have the definition again. I'll just comment that out actually. Now in the function, let's say I pass in something like 5. Now if I go and build and run this, you'll get errors. You can see in the error list, for example, too many arguments in function call. Function does not take one argument. We don't have any parameters, right? Between parentheses, we don't have anything right there. Okay. Another thing is, let's say I have something like this, right? Now we have a formal parameter called x, which is an integer. And let's just return that, why not? Now you'll notice in the header here, okay, in the prototype, that I can pass that in. So I can just do int. I do not have to specify a name for that. And the same thing for your other parameters as well. So let's say if you have multiple parameters, you can just give the type. You don't need to have the name. The name you can add in the definition. But now you'll see we'll get a red squiggly here. And Control F5 to build this, and once again, too few arguments in function call. Does not take 0 arguments. Let's just give that a 5. If I run that, we get this printed out, so that works fine. So this is very useful because even though down here we call this function right in main, it has not been defined. It is defined down here, but we do have this prototype, and the prototype helps the compiler to understand that we have this formal parameter, which is an integer. So this means when we call it, we need to pass at least an integer. Again, you can do multiple things in here as well. Okay, and you can see that I have these two types now. I'm only specifying the type, which might be a bit weird. And this again is to help the compiler so that it knows, okay, this function takes 2 parameters, and the first one needs to be an integer, the second one is a float. Then when I go and call this function, I pass those arguments, they'll work. And then of course you can see in the definition I give it a name. If you remove that, build and run, you can see that actually still works. But the problem is that we don't have a handle to that. So you need a handle. So here in this case I can return x, but I can't return this second thing that does not have a handle. So now that I have y, I can return y. So I'll just change this here to 1. That should work fine. Again, you're going to lose data if you do 1.5, for example. It's only going to return 1. Because the function returns an integer and we are returning a float. So that again is basic stuff from the variable section. That also once again applies when you use functions. So you might see it like this, where you don't have the names for the parameters, but it's not a good practice. You really want to give it those names. Let's say y. It's kind of bad practice to leave them out, so just go and add them. So going forward in module 102, when we talk about classes, these headers will also show up in your classes. We've actually seen headers briefly in the previous lessons, but in that case you'll go and declare your functions in one file, and then you'll typically go and define those in another file. Then you'll go and include the header in here, and then you can use those functions in main, for example. So again, a lot of stuff that we have to learn in module 102. So just a quick example where I wanted to show you a couple of things. Again, don't go and omit the variable names, your parameters you want to give, the type and the name. Then also the name is optional in the function prototype, but it's good practice to include them. And then we've looked at default arguments as well. Then one final thing before I end this video off. I'll change things around a bit. So we have two integers here. In the function prototype, I go and specify two integers, and I'll go and set a default argument for the first parameter. You can see this is complaining already. Default argument not at the end of parameter list. So build and run this and I get an error just because of that. Default argument not at the end of the parameter list. So you might say, well, this should work because I'm passing it to integers, like, it's just supposed to work. But in this case, you'll actually get an error. And this mainly has to do with, let's say you don't want to give this first parameter an argument, right? Typically you can skip default arguments and then they'll go and use the default argument. But in this case you have to specify a default argument. So if this actually worked, then you'd have to go and specify an argument, which will override that default argument. Or maybe you pass the same thing, but the point is it's kind of a waste, because then you have to write that parameter in. You have to pass an argument anyway, and you'll have to go and pass an argument for this final parameter anyway, because it does not have a default argument. But if we go and set a default argument for that, something like 0, this works fine. So just keep these things in mind. And so I hope this section was useful to you. I wanted to demonstrate quite a few things here, and I think I'll leave it here and then we'll move on to the next video.